BP added more than $70 billion to the U.S. economy in 2022 by making investments from coast to coast. Investments like building charging hubs for fleets of electric buses in California and starting up new infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Have you heard? You can listen to your gripping investigations ad-free. Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app or visit amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. That's amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. And catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
We all have cases that for some reason or other haunt us, that we can't stop thinking about. These are the ones that might sometimes keep us awake at night as we turn over all the possibilities in our mind.
For me, the story of D.B. Cooper is definitely one of those cases. It's not a murder case, but it is a missing person case. On November 24th, 1971, a man the world has come to know as D.B. Cooper hijacked a passenger plane and demanded a ransom of $200,000. After he got his money, he parachuted out into the night sky and was never seen again.
Who was he? Why did he do it? What happened to him after he leapt out into the darkness?
To get an idea of some of the possibilities, we turn to Eric Ulis. Eric is a widely recognized expert on the case. You may have seen him discuss it on the History Channel and CNN. And he has some ideas on how the mystery surrounding Cooper can finally be solved.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, a conversation with Eric Ulis.
To start off with, I think maybe it would be best if you could just tell us a bit about yourself and how you got interested in this case.
Yeah, I think I first heard of the case as a kid, probably in the late 70s. Leonard Nimoy had a show called In Search Of, and one of the episodes was about the D.B. Cooper mystery. And I think that aired in 78. So that was a couple of years before the money was found, or a portion of the ransom was found. Buried along the Columbia River. And I was 12 years old at that point, and a big aviation buff. Still am, I guess, but certainly as a 12-year-old kid, I was definitely an aviation buff. And I suspect that that's probably what piqued my interest initially, because this was a crime that involved, obviously, an airliner. And it's one of those things that over the years I just had a passing interest. Things would occasionally appear in the newspaper or on TV, that type of thing. And I would, just kind of keep an eye on it, I guess, as things happen to materialize. And then I want to say it was about 15 years ago where, for whatever reason, this idea crossed my mind. I wonder if I could actually solve this thing, because I knew that the case was still unsolved. And I just thought, you know what, there's got to be a way to figure this thing out. I mean, it's real. It really happened. This isn't Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster we're talking about here. This is a real event. So I started.
I think we'd be very interested in hearing about what steps you've taken to try to solve this. I think our audience would be extremely interested in that. But before we get into that, I think there are some people out there who might not be familiar with the basics of the case. So I wonder,
Sure.
could you start by just running through what D.B. Cooper did?
Yeah. So on November 24th, 1971, which was Thanksgiving Eve, an unidentified man showed up at the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter in Portland, Oregon, and purchased a one-way ticket from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He gave the ticket agent the name Dan Cooper and proceeded to head to the gate. Now, within the hour, he actually handed one of the flight attendants a note as the jet was taxiing to the runway. It was still on the ground. It was taxiing to the runway. And the note said that he had a bomb and that he wanted the flight attendant to come sit by him. So, of course, she did that. And at that point, he opened an attaché case that he had sitting on his lap that appeared to show a bomb, and said that they were being skyjacked, and he had some demands. Now, this is as the jet is literally rolling down the runway and taking off from Portland up to Seattle. And that started a whole series of events over the next several hours, including demands that he made, which essentially amounted to: he wants $200,000 in cash, he wants 2 front parachutes, and he wants 2 back parachutes. And he wants all of these things staged at the airport in Seattle before he will let the jet land, and obviously before he lets the passengers go. And so the authorities did manage to get everything finally staged at Seattle. They were a little late. The jet actually landed at 5:40 p.m. He wanted this all staged by 5 p.m., but he did land, let the jet land. And at that point, the first thing that came on board the jet was the $200,000 in cash, which was a 20-pound bag of cash with $10,020 bills in it. He let the passengers go at that point. Then he had the 4 parachutes. And when I say 4 parachutes, I'm talking 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes. He had those brought on board the jet. And he let 2 of the 3 flight attendants go as well. And the jet was refueled, and he said, let's head to Mexico. And that started a series of conversations with the pilots because they said they simply couldn't fly that far without refueling somewhere along the way. So he agreed to let them refuel in Reno, Nevada. Now, it's very important that when they took off from Seattle, he also had some demands, very specific demands about the configuration of the jet, meaning he didn't want the jet to fly over 10,000 feet in altitude. He wanted the landing gear to remain down. He wanted the flaps to remain down at a very specific 15-degree flap setting. He wanted the jet to be unpressurized, and he wanted the lights off. So, it was flying in a very drag-heavy configuration. And about 36 minutes after taking off from Seattle, on its way to Reno, ostensibly to refuel to head over to Mexico, there was this pressure bump that the pilots experienced. And this is a critical part that I actually forgot as well. This was a Boeing 727, and the Boeing 727 was a unique airliner in that it had this air stairs apparatus that deployed from the back bottom of the fuselage. So it was essentially built-in air stairs. So when the jet was at a small airport, for example, they didn't need a truck with stairs on it or a jetway or anything of that nature. They could simply, deploy this back air stairs apparatus, and passengers could, board the jet or deplane the jet. But he wanted those jet air stairs hanging open in flight. So, and they were. He lowered them in flight as the jet was flying south. And again, about 36 minutes after taking off, the pilots experienced a pressure bump, which the authorities later learned was when D.B. Cooper actually climbed down those stairs while the jet was flying at 10,000 feet and 200 miles an hour and jumped out. When he jumped off those air stairs, essentially they sprung back up like a diving board almost, into the back bottom of the fuselage and created this popping sensation in their ears. But he's never been seen or heard from again. So officially, at this point, the authorities don't know where he came from. They don't know where he went. They don't know whether he lived or died, and they don't know his real name. I should mention finally here that he did give the name, as I mentioned before, Dan Cooper at the ticket counter. But one of the media reporters made a mistake reporting on the skyjacking and pegged his name as D.B. Cooper. And authorities quickly realized, and the media quickly realized, no, that's a mistake. His name was actually Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper. But D.B. Cooper just stuck. People just thought, that's a cooler sounding name, I guess. So it's just stuck. And it's just been called D.B. Cooper ever since. So here we are 52 years later, still trying to figure out who this guy was and where he went.
And still getting his name wrong.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and it's funny because there are a couple purists out there who refuse to call him Dan, D.B. Cooper. He's got to be called Dan Cooper because that's the name that he gave. But I'm the opposite. I'm like, you know what? I like D.B. Cooper. That's just kind of a cool name, so I'm going to roll with that.
Yeah, so, the initials sound cooler, I will admit.
You mentioned this. Some of the money was found. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, in 1980, so about 8 years after the skyjacking, there was a family that was on the beach in Vancouver, Washington, just across the river from Portland, Oregon. And they happened to discover 3 rotted packs of $20 bills, part of D.B. Cooper's ransom, totaling $6,000, buried in the sand, just below the surface of the sand. And they had obviously been there for a very long time because they were quite rotted. In fact, about 75% of the bills had rotted away. And there's 3 packets. And importantly, it was found at a point on the beach that was about 50 feet from the water's edge and about 9 feet above the level of the river under normal conditions. So what I'm getting at is that the river doesn't reach that spot normally. So it's impossible that he could have, jumped that night, landed in the river, and it just washed up, on the river, from the river. That's impossible because the river wasn't that high up. So that's been sort of an enigma built into this as well, a mystery within a mystery. How did $6,000 of D.B. Cooper's money end up buried on this beach, in Vancouver, Washington? And it's critically important to note that where it was found was about 15 to 20 miles as the crow flies from the drop zone, specifically the area where the FBI thinks he jumped. And there is no physical way, no natural physical way that those 3 packets could have arrived at this beach called Tena Bar. T-E-N-A is how it's spelled, Tena Bar. There's no physical way that the money could have, or no natural way the money could have arrived there. So it does appear that, appears that the money was buried there, and presumably D.B. Cooper buried it himself. So make of that what you will.
Here at the Murder Sheet, we work on the podcast and our investigative reporting full time. That means we sometimes don't have time to meticulously plan and cook delicious and nutritious meals. So, in this new year, we are eternally grateful to our sponsor, Factor.
Now's a great time to try out ready-to-eat meal delivery service Factor. Remember, when you support our great sponsors like Factor, you're supporting us and our ability to keep doing this work. So please consider visiting factormeals.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 to get 50% off.
Factor allows you to pop your ready-made meal into the microwave. In 2 minutes flat, you'll have a hot and ready dish with minimal cleanup afterward. It's just that simple.
Also, this food is awesome. I recently dug their black bean and rice enchilada bowl with roasted zucchini, corn, and salsa verde. It tasted so fresh and flavorful.
I love that we get to skip meal prep, the grocery stores, expensive to-go orders, and elaborate cleanup. Plus, there's plenty of options for extra picky eaters like me.
We've really been thrilled with Factor, and we feel you will be too if you're striving to eat healthy and save time in 2024. It's really helped me meet my nutritional goals for the new year.
Head to factormeals.com factormeals.com/imsheet50 and use code imsheet50 to get 50% off. That's code imsheet50 at factormeals.com/imsheet50 to get 50% off. This is all very intriguing. It's a very intriguing case. And maybe part of the reason why it's intriguing is because, like you mentioned earlier, it seems like it could be solvable or should be solvable. So now can you discuss some of the things you have done to try to find answers in this case?
Yeah, again, I started looking very seriously at this case about 15 years ago. And, I'm not the kind of person that's really into conspiracy theories or, things of that nature. I mean, I really wanted to figure out who the real guy was. So, fortunately, what has it been? About 7 years ago now, through the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI files were opened up to the public. So the FBI started releasing some original case files going all the way back to the night of the skyjacking. And there's about 30,000 pages worth that have been released at this point. So I've read through those 30,000 pages, and about every 6 months, or rather every 6 weeks, there's another, 500 or so pages that are released. Now, a lot of these are heavily redacted and are of little value, but there are still little diamonds, built into that thing, little gems built into that really tell a story. So I dug into those pretty heavily, but more importantly, I think, is I've gone out of my way to really leverage today's technology, and specifically related to the tie, because one of the things, when the jet landed in Reno, Nevada to refuel, D.B. Cooper was gone, of course. The money was gone. The bomb was gone. Pretty much everything was gone. However, there was a skinny black clip-on tie that was left on board the seat. It was on his seat on board the jet. And this is the tie that D.B. Cooper had been wearing. Now, in 1971, it wasn't of much value. There wasn't much they could do forensically with it. But in recent years, there's been an awful lot that we've been able to do forensically. And specifically, there was a scientific analysis that was put under a scanning electron microscope, basically. And that identified something north of 100,000 very unique and rare kind of particles on the tie, rare earth elements, titanium metals, aluminum, stainless steel, a whole array of things that are really kind of unique and interesting for 1971 and appear to be consistent with the aerospace sector, somebody who worked in the aerospace sector, which makes a lot of sense because, of course, Seattle is where Boeing was located. It was a Boeing jet. D.B. Cooper, whoever this guy was, appeared to be familiar with Boeing 727 and just aviation in general. So that's one area that I've spent a lot of time looking into, is related to the tie particles. Specifically, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, actually, I discovered among the particles, 3 particles of a very rare titanium and antimony alloy that appears to be consistent with a U.S. patent that was procured by a company that's no longer around, a company called Remcrew Titanium that was based in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And they were a specialty metals manufacturer, and they were a major subcontractor for Boeing, and as well as other aerospace companies. So they created a lot of the specialty metals that Boeing used on their commercial aircraft as well as their military aircraft back in the 60s and 70s and even beyond. So it does appear, in my mind, that D.B. Cooper, because he had this stuff on his tie, and specifically these 3 very rare titanium and antimony particles, it does appear that D.B. Cooper actually worked at that company in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, leading up to the point that the skyjacking took place. So, it's a fascinating thing. And there's also DNA that I'm trying to get my hands on, which is kind of a lengthy story. But again, I think that really, as far as my main thrust has been concerned, it's really been trying to leverage science, to see if they can come up with some answers, because of course the state of the art technology that we have nowadays is far and away ahead of what it was back in 1971. And I've also been actively searching because I believe very firmly that the FBI made a few mistakes. That's pretty clear. And I think one of the mistakes was the flight path that they were working with, which identified this drop zone, this area where they believed D.B. Cooper landed, which, remember, was about 15 or 20 miles from where the money was found. So simply put, I think that flight path was slightly askew. I think there was a mistake into that flight path. In other words, they were searching in the wrong area. Specifically, I think that the path that they worked with was not the path for the skyjacked airliner, but actually one of the military chase jets. So I personally believe very firmly that D.B. Cooper actually landed probably about a mile or so from where the money was found. So I've actually, over the last few years, have spent quite a bit of time heading in that area searching, because I do believe D.B. Cooper's parachutes and perhaps the bomb, perhaps some of the money is still out there, but certainly the parachutes, the main parachute that he jumped with, that would still be out there somewhere. It's just a matter of finding it.
Absolutely. I want to ask you more about the DNA, but before that, this is a very nerdy question. But can you tell us more about the Foya that sort of started you off on this? Did you file it? Did others in the community? How long did that take? The reason I ask, and our listeners will know this, is because Kevin filed a Foya on a FBI case from the 70s and literally waited 3 years?
Yeah.
3 years for it. He actually has been waiting on that longer than he's been married to me. So I was just curious what your experience with that was.
The FOIA request that opened everything up was not from me. It was from a gentleman named Tom Colbert and his attorney, a guy named Mark Zaid. And this was filed back in 2016. And I'm not sure of the exact process that it went through. I know they ended up going to court because I think initially the FBI said, we're not going to hand over anything. But ultimately, it did go to court, and the matter was resolved. And again, they're releasing files to the tune of, like I said, about 500 pages every 6 weeks or so. Now, separate from that, there is matter related to D.B. Cooper's clip-on tie that I mentioned there. Now, the clip-on tie is in the custody of the FBI, of course, at their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I filed a FOIA request probably two years ago, something like that, 2 to 3 years ago, asking to get access to the tie because I identified a very specific part of the tie that I believe that there is likely a full DNA profile for D.B. Cooper. And ultimately they came back and first of all, they said they didn't know where the tie was. And then they said that this didn't fall under the purview of FOIA, so they basically disregarded my request. Now, I happened to be at FBI headquarters in October of 2021, so, a little over 2 years ago. And when I was there, I actually saw the tie with my own eyes. So I said, well, I know where the tie is because, again, that was somewhat of a matter of discussion. Where's the tie?
Oh my God!
And I don't know what the story is. I just get the impression that somebody was just too lazy to do their due diligence. But obviously, me seeing it with my own eyes, I'm like, well, I can tell you where your tie is, sitting in Washington D.C. So, but the other matter with respect to trying to get access to the tie, saying that didn't fall under the purview of FOIA, I disagreed with. So I filed a federal lawsuit in Washington, D.C. It's been a little over 9 months now, trying to get access to the tie. And we're still waiting to hear from the judge. We're waiting for some sort of ruling from the judge with respect to this. But I will say that my dealings with FOIA and the FBI specifically have been, they haven't been accommodating at all. It's been very, very frustrating. I've actually had cases or situations with the FBI whereby I requested specific documentation, and they actually agreed to the Foya request. And then they came back months later and said, we can't find the documents. And I'm like, the documents are there. Someone's just not looking, or whatever the case may happen to be. So, that's it. It's been an unpleasant experience, and frankly, I don't think they've really lived up to the spirit of the law, which is pretty clear that these kind of documents and this kind of information should be made available to the public, and they have an obligation. That is, the FBI and other government agencies have an obligation to provide this information, this documentation, to the degree that doesn't infringe or impugn upon an existing prosecution or something of that nature. But they've been very unaccommodating in that sense. So it's been a little frustrating, but that's the nature of the beast.
I can imagine it must be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, we feel your pain on this.
But I'm struck by how much information you've been able to get from this tie, even without access to it. You've built a compelling case for where Cooper may have worked. And so the obvious question is, are there any suspects you can talk about who did work at Boeing?
Yeah, and to be clear, the person that I've identified as a person of interest did not actually work at Boeing. He worked for this company called Remcrew Titanium, the subcontractor, which is where it was the subcontractor that had the patent and manufactured this very specific alloy. And it was never, it's sort of an experimental thing, and never made was never really commercially developed or distributed or anything of that nature. But I do have one specific person of interest, a guy named Vince Peterson. He worked in the titanium research lab there in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. He passed away in 2002. So I want to be very clear. He's just a compelling person of interest in my mind. Obviously, Mr. Peterson is no longer alive, so he cannot speak for himself and can't obviously defend himself. So I don't want to be accusing anybody of anything, but I'll just say that he's a very interesting, compelling person of interest, because he does appear to not only match the physical parameters for D.B. Cooper, a guy that was about 50 years old, a guy that was about 6'1" tall, has a certain general appearance, but also with respect to, he was in the right place to have picked up these tie particles. And that's a hard sell. That's hard. That's hard to find somebody who was wearing a tie back then who can account for all of the particles on the tie, because again, there's quite an exotic array of particles on the tie. And he is about the only person I'm aware of that can actually account for all of these particles. Very interestingly as well, his old supervisor, his former supervisor, is still alive. At least he was still alive as of a year or two ago. He was 90 years old at the time. And I spoke with the supervisor, and the supervisor mentioned to me that there was a very small group of men that worked in this titanium research lab, one of whom was Mr. Peterson. When I say small, I mean about eight engineers. Now, they had assistants and so forth, but the assistants didn't wear ties. The engineers did. But he also said, the supervisor mentioned that Mr. Peterson actually traveled to Seattle, to Boeing on business, and that he was the only person to do that for this Remcrew Titanium, in addition to the supervisor himself. So it's very interesting, because I can put Mr. Peterson obviously in Seattle, at Boeing on the floor during the time that the Boeing 727 was being produced and manufactured there in Seattle. So it's all very interesting. But having said that, I do think that it's going to take, something along the lines of getting access to the tie and procuring a DNA profile before we know with certainty whether he was D.B. Cooper or whether he was not D.B. Cooper. Because at the end of the day, it's a binary choice. Vince Peterson was either 100% D.B. Cooper or he was 100% not D.B. Cooper. It's one or the other. So hopefully we'll be able to figure this thing out once we get access to the tie, which I'm confident we will. confident eventually that'll happen.
I'm wondering, just going back to the FBI aspect of this, do you have a sense of why they would not want you to test DNA? Like, wouldn't that be a good thing for everyone to figure this out once and for all?
It's a pain in the ass. That's basically it. I mean, honestly, they closed the case in July 2016, unsolved, and they just don't want to have anything else to do with it. I mean, that's really, I think, what it comes down to. It involves work. Somebody's got to, give us access to the tie. They're certainly not going to test them for themselves anymore because it's expensive and it's time consuming and all that kind of stuff. But that's really the only thing I can figure out. I mean, other than that, I just don't know. I've been asked many times, is the FBI concerned about are they concerned about how it would look, having someone like me who's just a private citizen solving the case, solving the case, and they couldn't solve it after all these years. And I suppose there's probably a part, that may be part of it to a certain degree, but I don't think there's any room for pride in these kind of matters. I mean, you got to put pride aside. If there's a legitimate opportunity to perhaps solve this case, that's what they need to be doing. And again, I'm not asking them to expend public resources or anything of that nature. I'm just simply asking the FBI to give me access to the tie with a DNA specialist for half an hour. We'll go to Washington, D.C. The tie remains in their possession. They just open the door and pull the tie out. And, for no more than 30 minutes, the DNA expert swabs a couple areas of that tie. Then we take that material and have it processed, have it analyzed through a lab and see what we can come up with. So I don't know. I'm not really sure what the objection would be from the FBI, but for whatever reason, they have definitely played hardball. And I've talked about this extensively. I mean, I was on CNN with Jake Tapper probably a month and a half ago, and Jake Tapper himself, right on the show at the end of the segment, challenged the FBI director, Christopher Wray, said, if you're not doing anything with the tie, Director Wray, why not just give Eric and his DNA expert, why not just give him access, see what they come up with? What's the downside?
Yes.
So it's not just me. I mean, I think a lot of people look at it and say, what the hell's the problem here? Just give him access.
Listen, if this was like a highly sensitive murder case and they were actively working it and there was the possibility that private citizens could accidentally damage I could understand where they were coming from. But in this situation, they're seemingly not doing anything with it. This is an opportunity to finally have some closure on, something that wasn't necessarily like a murder, but certainly was a traumatic experience for, I'm sure, those who survived it, and just everyone wants to know. So I'm with you guys on that one. I don't understand it. Here's a question that's a little bit depressing, or maybe I'm not sure. Like, you mentioned having at least one person of interest at this point. What do you think of the theory that he died out there, he didn't survive the jump, and his body's just never been found?
I think there's 0% chance that happened. And the reason why is because the evidence simply doesn't back it up. You have to start with the fact that nothing was ever found. You didn't find a corpse. You didn't find, the parachute strewn about the ground. Didn't find an attaché case, anything of that nature. Or for that matter, the bulk of the money. None of this was found. And if D.B. Cooper died, dead men don't walk. They can't, if he's dead, he can't walk out of the area and hide everything and conceal everything. The other thing is that, when we're talking about the $6,000 that was found, we were talking three of the packets that were found stacked on top of each other just below the surface of the sand. And again, as I mentioned before, where they were found, it appears with certainty in my mind that those three packets had to have been buried by a person. And if they were buried by a person, then in all likelihood it was D.B. Cooper himself. So, and it's been 52 years. And we're not talking Siberia here or Antarctica. We're talking Clark County, Washington. I mean, there's a significant number of people that live in this area, and people have been looking for the guy. Not only law enforcement, but treasure hunters and hunters out there, and other people engaged in recreation for years have been out in that area enjoying the Pacific Northwest, and many of whom have actually been looking for the guy in a specific target area and have never found him. So I think it's very, very clear that he walked away. That's why we haven't found anything, is because he walked away. And I've said this many times before, because the FBI likes to spin this yarn that he probably died or whatever the case may happen to be. And at the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. The last time anybody saw him, he was alive. He was alive with a parachute. That was the last time anybody saw him. So if he jumps out of the back of the jet, never to be seen or heard from again, it seems to me that the default position has got to be he's still alive, or, at least at that point. And so I think that's it just defies common sense. The other critical thing I should mention as well is there ended up being several copycats that tried doing similar things after D.B. Cooper, all of whom got caught. But importantly, most of the copycats, believe it or not, had never jumped before, had never even put on a parachute before. Yet they still did it. They still jumped out of an airliner at 10,000 feet with the loot. And again, all of them got caught. Also, very importantly, every single one survived, not a single fatality, most of whom had never even jumped before. So what makes D.B. Cooper different? What makes him unique? Why is he the one guy that died that somehow nobody can find any evidence of that having been the case? And of course, that mysterious $6,000 that was found along the beach. So again, I am absolutely convinced, 100%, that he landed in good shape and just simply walked out.
I'm curious, do you believe, based on the evidence, based on your review of this, that he was able to walk out with the remainder, or at least some of the money?
Yeah, I actually think he got away with $194,000 because, while on the surface you look at it and you think, what the heck, how did $6,000 end up there? Where's the rest of it? What's it doing over here? I think the answer is actually pretty obvious. It's important to note that when D.B. Cooper asked for the $200,000, he actually asked for it in a knapsack, because it's obvious that what he was going to do is he was going to put this knapsack, this backpack on. He was probably going to wear it backwards, wear it in reverse, and then have a parachute on his back. But it didn't show up that way. When the authorities delivered the money, it was delivered in a cheap white canvas bank bag. Didn't have snaps on it, didn't have a drawstring, didn't have a zipper, nothing. It was really just kind of a bag. And D.B. Cooper immediately recognized, this is a problem. I can't jump, at 200 miles an hour for 10,000 feet up with this bag, because the money's, obviously going to go everywhere. So I think that what he did is he took a portion of the money out to lighten the load in the bag, because the bag was not very sturdy. And I have one of the bags, so I've tried this, so I know what I'm talking about as far as this goes. So I think he took part of the money out and housed part of the ransom in one of the reserve parachutes, because he also jumped with a reserve parachute that he could not have been using as a reserve, as a backup safety measure, for a number of reasons. So I believe he put part of the money in there to lighten the load in the bag, and then he kept the rest of the ransom in the bank bag. And we've got witnesses saying that, he cannibalizing shroud line from one of the 4 parachutes, used it to tie the money bag up and everything else pretty thoroughly, and ultimately tie all the stuff to his person. So I think what happened here is that D.B. Cooper, when he jumped, and I should note that I think it's also obvious that his initial plan was to jump in the outskirts of Seattle. I think his initial plan was, once the jet took off from Seattle, 6 or 7 minutes out, in the excerpt somewhere, his plan was to jump. But there were a couple of things that got in the way, and he ended up jumping about half an hour later near Vancouver, near Portland. But to me, it's obvious that when he landed near the Columbia River, of course, he walked to the river because he realized he had to bury the cash. You couldn't very well walk into town carrying the cash. That would be crazy. It's a surefire way to get arrested. So right. I think he made his way to the beach, using a stick or whatever kind of implement was on the ground there. Just his hands carved out a hole in the sand, threw the bag of cash in the hole, and I think he extracted those loose packets that he had put in the reserve parachute. I think he extracted those from the reserve parachute and also threw those in the hole and buried it all up. And then I believe he came back a period of time later, presumably under cover of darkness. I can't see him doing this in the middle of the day. And he retrieved it. So he probably, had a couple landmarks in mind and uncovered the bag and pulled the money bag out of its grave and some of those loose packets or what have you. But I think just unbeknownst to him, 3 of those loose packets that were also buried there in the hole in the sand just simply were overlooked and got left behind. And ultimately, I think that's what was found a few years later in 1980. So I think that explains how you have those 3 isolated packets sitting there. And importantly, that I think that indicates that as for the $194,000 that's still outstanding, that he actually got away with it.
Now, earlier, of course, we both agreed that this case seems solvable. And so that actually raises an interesting question. Why wasn't this case solved in 1971?
Well, at the end of the day, there's a few things. First of all, it was 1971. So we don't have DNA testing, scanning electron microscopes, everybody with a cell phone in their hand, GPS, that kind of, we obviously they just don't have the same tools back then in 71 that they do, 52, 53 years later, 2023, 2024. The other thing is that Cooper was just 1 or 2 steps ahead of the authorities the entire way. And, it's obvious to me that Cooper, part of what made Cooper unique is he didn't talk about it. He didn't brag about it. Part of how some of these copycats got caught wasn't because they failed and didn't manage to jump and get away. It's because they jumped and got away, but bragged about it. And then 5 days later that, word got back to the authorities and then all of a sudden there's somebody knocking on their door. So it's apparent to me that Cooper did a very good job of just simply not talking about it, not bragging to his buddies or obviously going to the local Cadillac dealership and buying a brand new Cadillac in cash, anything foolish like that. Mm-hmm. So, 1 or 2 steps ahead of the authorities, very careful about his movements once he got away with it. I think that had a lot to do with it as well. So I think that's really primarily the lion's share of how he managed to get away. Now, to be sure, I think there were also a couple of critical errors that the FBI made in their investigation that didn't help. And so I think it's almost sort of the perfect storm in a way. I think it would be impossible to replicate that nowadays. But back in 71, D.B. Cooper, I believe he was successful. And it was, I think, largely a testament to his, paying attention to detail and obviously being very disciplined about certain things. I think that's the majority of the reason he got away was because of that. But I think there was also that other aspect, which is just, some flaws on the part of investigators in the intervening decades.
And this is such an intriguing case that once it gets its hooks into people, they tend to want to talk about it and discuss it. And so actually there is a vibrant community that has grown around this case, both online and in real life at events like CooperCon. Can you tell us a little bit about the community around this case?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. There is a pretty vibrant community here that's built around this case. One of which is an annual event called CooperCon, which I actually founded in 2018. So we just had the 5th annual CooperCon, took place in November in Seattle. And, it's a 3-day event. We get experts and and firsthand witnesses. You know, the guy was a passenger on the jet who sat directly across from D.B. Cooper. He was there, you know, and we interviewed him on stage. You know, the former FBI agent who headed up the investigation, obviously before it was closed, he was interviewed on stage. One of the copycat skyjackers that I talked about that tried, you know, that was inspired by D.B. Cooper and did the same exact thing, but ended up getting caught. He was on stage. We had him there as well. So it's just fascinating because people just find this to be an interesting case, and it is interesting. In addition to that, I actually founded a Facebook group as well called the D.B. Cooper Mystery Group, which I founded probably two years ago, something like that. So as it stands now, it's a little north of 4,400 members, and it's a great place where people can get together and talk about theories and suspects and ideas, and occasionally argue or bicker about things. but it's actually it's been a terrific resource because it's amazing the people that you see that join the group like this. Scientists and attorneys and former law enforcement personnel, pilots and so forth, all of whom, or many of whom, who contribute in their own way. You know, they have an area of expertise, and I think that that's really kind of the modern day version, if you will, of the investigation. Because again, the FBI is no longer investigating this thing. They closed the books on this in 2016, so it's really up to us. You know, people like myself and others who have a passion and are interested in, you know, trying to figure out who this guy was and what happened. And, certainly something like the Facebook group is an ideal spot to get people together and to dig into the case in details and uncover facts and things of that nature. So, but it is remarkable. And that in turn has led to a fair amount of, you know, documentaries and certainly podcasts and things of that nature and a lot of media coverage, frankly, as well. That every year there's a fair amount of media coverage related to the case in one shape or form, all of which keeps it fresh in people's minds and introduces the case to maybe younger people and others who, for whatever reason, aren't familiar with the case. And I think that's a critical component as well. I think it's really important to that people are aware of this case, because it's been 52 years. It hasn't been 500 years, just 52. So there's a very real possibility that, you know, even though D.B. Cooper is likely no longer alive at this point, because he would be very old, you know, around 100, certainly the man had relatives. And, you know, the hope is that maybe at some point science can't close the book on the case, as I mentioned earlier. You know, perhaps somebody, a grandson, a granddaughter, somebody like that, you know, realizes that Grandpa Fred has strangely, a stash of old $20 bills, or maybe a handwritten note that appears to have, you know, demands on it, you know, for, you know, $200,000 in cash or whatever. You know, I mean, you know, there may be evidence there that somebody finds it somewhere down the road, and obviously, if they're unfamiliar with the D.B. Cooper case, that may be of little value. But if they've heard of the case, they may think, maybe Grandpa Fred was this D.B. Cooper guy. So that's an important part as well.
Absolutely. That would be wild if just somebody's just cleaning out their grandparents' attic after they pass away and then just find that. And I just want to say, like, having, you know, we're in the true crime space. We see how often, you know, communities can devolve into, you know, just outlandish stuff or ridiculous stuff or ghoulish stuff. I really feel like the Cooper community is a lot more, I don't know, like, positive than that from what I've seen so far. Like, there really does seem to be this kind of community-minded spirit to, like, let's figure this out, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think that you're largely right. I mean, when you get a group of, you know, in the case of the Facebook group, 4,400 people together, you occasionally have a bad apple, or you know, or you have people that are territorial in a way. But I think by and large, that is I think I do a pretty good job policing that on the group. And, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, I look at the case myself and I'm asked, you know, why do I want to solve it? And honestly, I can't tell you it's because I believe I bleed law enforcement blue or anything, and I'll be damned if this guy's going to get away with it. I mean, I don't. It's like I don't give a shit at this point. It's been 52 years. Like, it's just, I mean, it's not my role to
get him, Eric.
Yeah, just kind of like, I just honestly, that part of it, I don't care. I mean, at this point, I've said this to people before that, this is not my. It's been so long at this point. It's not my role to judge this guy. I mean, he's gonna, I don't know what the story is or whatever the case may happen to be, but that's above my pay grade. That's not my job. It's really more a matter of, I'm just the guy who wants to figure that. I'm the kid who tried to crack the Rubik's Cube, that kind of thing. Just how my mind works is like, I know it's real. I know it's solvable. I do firmly believe that we have enough of the puzzle that we know where we can figure it out. We can solve the thing. It's just a matter of, it's just an elaborate riddle. And it's just a matter of just sort of being clever and putting the pieces together. I'll give you an example. At CooperCon this year, I actually put forward a riddle. And I said, this is actually very analogous to the D.B. Cooper case in my mind, or at least the way I view the Cooper case. I said, here's the riddle, basically. There was a child born this year, 2023, born this year, somewhere in the continental United States. And they were born on March 12th at 2:37 in the morning. What state was the child born in? Now, you hear that and you think, okay, so there's a child born in the continental United States, March 12th, 2023, 2:37 in the morning. What state were they born in? You would think, how could you possibly know which state they were born in? The reality is I've actually given you enough information in the riddle right there to actually solve the riddle, solve the problem. And this is, like I said, this is analogous to D.B. Cooper because I believe there is actually enough information out there to solve it. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together. But do either of you have a guess?
Eric, you're going to come on our show and humiliate us for being terrible at riddles? Kevin's, you can't see him, but he's pointing at me like I'm going to do it, and I have no idea. Okay, I'm just going to pull something out of I'm going to completely guess. I have no idea. I'm just going to say California.
It's actually Arizona. And the reason it's Arizona is it relates to daylight saving time, because that's when daylight saving time kicks in. So spring full must fall back.
That's so good.
What happens, of course, is daylight saving time at 2 o'clock in the morning, you go from 2 o'clock immediately to 3 o'clock. So there is no 2 o'clock hour in at all, anywhere in the United States, continental United States, with the one exception, the state of Arizona, which does not observe daylight saving time. So it's the only possible state the child could have been born in.
Oh my God.
That's it. That's how the riddle works.
Good. That's really cool. Well, now everyone has a cool riddle to share and blow their friends and family's minds. But truly, I think that's a great analogy. And I feel like the more you talk about it, really does sound solvable. We really hope you prevail in court and get that tie and that, this further developments. But in the meantime, if people want to follow your work, read your work, you've done so much work on this case. Can you tell us about, your book? Can you tell us about where they can follow you?
Yeah, I've got a book that I actually initially wrote a book about it that was in PDF format rather, and now I've updated into a book called Silver Bullet related to the case. And as you know, I've actually been trying to get this thing wrapped up and polished, but we are moving so fast right now with new developments constantly happening literally month by month. I'm like, well, I don't want to wrap it up until I know what happens with the lawsuit or what happens with the search that we're doing near where the money was found of this wooded trench area where the parachute may be or whatever. So that's what's going on there. But it is a matter of time before that happens. But other than that, if anybody's interested, I do have a personal website, which is ericulis.com, which has has information there related to a lot of what I've done on the case and so forth. And and certainly the Facebook group as well, the DB Cooper Mystery Group, is a way for people to join the group and obviously stay plugged in and contribute as well. One of the things to go back to the Facebook group, one of the things that I've really been very vocal about is encouraging everybody to get involved. There is a tendency for people who are not terribly familiar with a case to want to kind of be quiet and just observe and not, ask this quote unquote stupid question or whatever the case may happen to be. And I've let it be known that there are no stupid questions. I mean, at the end of the day, we get the same questions asked over and over again, and that's fine. That's okay. I mean, nobody's, if a person doesn't want to answer it, they don't have to answer it. But I think it's a healthy part of bringing new blood and fresh ideas into the case. And I think ultimately that's what's going to take to solve this thing. You get enough minds working together, and it's eventually going to happen. And I think I've contributed my part. I like to think that at the end of the day, I'll be the person who solves this thing, but maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's never solved. I don't think that's the case. I actually do think it will be solved. My prediction is by the time the 60th anniversary comes around, which is in a little under 8 years from now, I think for all intents and purposes, we will have figured out who this guy was.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And yeah, thank you so much.
This has been great. We really appreciate it. And maybe at some point we'll ask you to come back with a solution. Or also, I find your theory about Oswald's third shot in the JFK case to be intriguing. So I'd love to talk to you about that sometime.
I tell you what, the third shot thing, I know it sounds ridiculous to say, but I don't even think it's theory. I mean, I think it's absolutely been proved.
Well, we will leave the conversation there for now, but would definitely have Eric back on to discuss his theory of the JFK assassination. We'd like to thank him for taking the time to talk with us today. If you want more information on what he's up to, you can check out his website at ericulis.com. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.